Okay, this is actually a little ahead of schedule because I didn't realize people would actually start watching the movie as quick as they did. Um, this is all tied into that video. So the first part of this is actually going to be sort of an explanation of the video. Usually when I do it in class, I actually sort of talk over it, but I had to post it in Panopto, so I can't figure out any way to do that effectively. So if you're watching that video, or you watched it, there's several things that are really key to that. One is in the first part, as at least one person already noted, it's important to remember that when people are in societies which have mana and the manipulation of mana is a normal way of doing things, or chi, depending on what you want to call it, that, as I mentioned last time, that people do not see that behavior and what those folks are doing as being what I think oftentimes in the United States would be called magic. Magic in the United States is a very complicated thing because it's seen as sort of in competition with religion rather than being part of religion. And of course, also you get the complication that when you think of magic, what you're actually in many cases talking about is sleight of hand. In other words, illusions. In fact, that's what they used to be called, illusionists, not magicians. So, there's this sort of, I don't know, this basically decrediting the idea of mana chi manipulation. I think specifically in American society, maybe because this idea of science and technology is so dominant. I'm not really sure. To be honest, I'm not that interested in why. But that was why I wanted you to at least watch the very first part of that cut that I gave you. Remember, that's actually part of an hour and 10-minute long video, which I'm pretty sure you can't find. It's vanished forever as far as I know. So the guy actually doing the acupuncture with chi and then setting fire to the paper is actually a very typical process. A lot of different sides. My own background, part of the family, were trained as witch smellers, and so technically we're witches, or at least those of us who are trained in it are. And though I don't, and I've never tried it, I do know that old members of the family, like 3 generations ago, if they wanted to, could start fires, and they didn't think anything of it. They didn't, because in most societies where you find the manipulation of mana or chi, when people actually use large amounts of it, which to a certain extent would be like the guy that was doing the acupuncture healing. There's a real strong concept in many societies, at least in a lot of Native American groups, that using mana in focused ways like that actually takes away your lifespan. So if you would, it's burning you out. So folks that do that type of stuff in many societies are very careful about when they do it. This is certainly true in Korea, where shamans are very common, and the use of mana is very, 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 very common. Folks that become specialists in that area generally figure they won't, if they start when they're, say, 15 years old, they generally figure they won't last beyond the age of 40. Because basically they've burned out their body through pushing that energy source through them. So this is why you don't see it done a lot. The use of mana or chi in most societies is very select, very particularistic, and is very much tied to concerns about that the users have about the impacts of what they're doing, regardless of the folks that are getting it done to them. The other part in there, and the other key thing I want you to know, well, actually it's 2 things. The second is that he has this really good analogy of behind the screen, which I really love, and I think that's absolutely key when you're thinking of the idea of religion. If you want to think of it, that's another way of looking at what Durkheim is talking about. Durkheim would argue, if you want to use that analogy, the folks watching the puppet show, or actually that's in the profane. They're sitting down, they're watching the shadows on the screen, and that's the normal, it's observable, etc. The reality of what the puppet show actually consists of, when he goes back behind the screen to see those beautifully painted puppets, which the audience will never see, the people doing the puppeting, or puppeteers, whatever they're called, that would actually be what Durkheim would call the sacre in some ways. So there's actually 2 forms of thing going on. There's the display that's happening that people are watching in the here and now. But there's also a whole other complex stuff that they're not actually, they cannot access. They can't understand it. They don't even know what you're talking about because they've never experienced that. All they've seen is the black and white shadow version. That would in most societies be the way that the complexity of the universe is ordered. When you talk about cosmology in many societies, what you're basically talking about is the stuff that's on the other side of the screen. And as when we get into magic, for example, that's what folks that are magicians or sorcerers or witches or whatever you want to call them, or shamans in most cases, that's their job, is by virtue of their skills, ability, and training. They go to that other side of the screen. And that's where you find mana and chi, among other things, and then bring that back or tap it. So the majority of population, that's why I asked you one of the reaction questions was, what are most people doing? Most people are standing very safely watching it. They don't want to be any more of a part of it than what they are. It's interesting to watch. There's probably something useful they're going to get out of it. And they sure as hell do not want to go into trance. And they sure as hell don't want to go on the other side of the screen, because they point out in the video, and in fact, someone noted, there's a very good chance you will come back. When you go into a heavy trance state, like what they're talking about there, like the guys are doing when they're going in that trance state to talk to the goddess, which means they're going, of course, to the other side of the screen, is there's a very good chance you'll get lost and you won't make it back. This is one of the things that, somehow is missing in the modern interpretations of magic. When you think like the Harry Potter or something like that. I never read that series, but at least in watching parts of the movies, I don't remember seeing anything there that sort of said that if you did magic, you could get sucked into it and you couldn't, you'd get trapped and you can't get out. Maybe they did, I don't know. But that's, again, one of the main reasons that people that are involved in that type of stuff don't do it, because there's a very high risk factor. No matter how good you are at it, there's a very strong sense that if you get too deep into the other side or somewhere, you might get lost and you can't make it back across the screen. And that's why when they talk about the video, you can get into trance and you can get out, and you cannot get out of trance. I mean, you're trapped in a situation where what you are is basically a permanent. And at that point, you'll eventually die. And this is actually quite common in places like Indonesia when people go into trance. It's very common for people to go into trance. And if there's someone not paying attention at the time, they'll die. They'll just not come out. They'll go basically catatonic, I guess you'd call it. And this is also why in many societies, when someone goes into trance without a structured setting. So for example, if someone decides they're going to go into a trance state, and especially today with social media, well, not social media, but the internet and stuff like that, it'd be very easy to, by virtue of music or visuals or something like that, to put yourself into a trance. If you think about some of the stuff I showed you when you're doing meditation, meditation is like a very small form of trance. It's not that hard to kick yourself into a deeper form of trance. So if you've got no one else around, you might not come out. And that's part and parcel when you're looking at the belief systems in many societies. So people that do this type of stuff in many societies are sort of seen as, in many ways, either sacrificing or risking part of themselves to do these. So people don't do it for entertainment. This is why if you're from a society like that, you see someone that's called a magician in American society, you're thinking, one, they're either doing illusions, which is just entertainment, or if they actually think they're actually doing something like this, and they're doing it for money, you're sort of like, well, do you realize the consequences of this? It's really interesting when you talk to Korean shamans, and I've talked to two, who very much believe in that traditional system. They do make money out of being shaman, or shamanesses, I should point out. But on the other hand, they basically have come to the conclusion they're never going to get old, or they're going to die before that. But they would never do it for entertainment, and they would never do it to satisfy people's curiosities. It's too risky. It's, if you want to think about it, manipulating mana and chi is equivalent to defusing bombs. You can be really, really good at it. It can be safe most of the time, but if there's one moment of inattention or something's a little bit different than what you expected, all of a sudden there's a big punk and you're just not there anymore. So when you're looking at that, that's the main thing with that video. That's a part of the world where these various forms of belief systems are very, very functional, very operative, and very much a part of people's daily lives. And if you want to, it'd be very different. But Hawaii prior to, say, the 1850s, that would have been the way that Hawaiians would have looked at the world around them. It would have much more complicated, much more diverse, much more sort of interactive world than the universalistic religion of Christianity that was brought in. So do watch that video. In fact, I'd strongly recommend that after maybe you listen to this, go back and watch it again. It's a, those two guys are pretty weird, but the type of stuff they're covering, I've never seen it covered in a more accurate way from the standpoint of people that actually do this stuff versus sort of the exotic Discovery Channel. Look at these weird people doing these weird belief systems or something like that. And that's not the way it is. Okay, totemic, just to go over this really quickly. Totemic is oftentimes, if you think of totems, like you find in the Pacific Northwest with Tlingit and other groups like that, that's actually not quite accurate. Totemic is basically oftentimes might be tied to an image, but it's the integration of magic in a clan, or if you want to, mana manipulation in a clan. So when we were talking about earlier, when I was talking about clans and the idea of ancestors, So for example, if you live in Kahana, your ancestor that built Kahana, made the valley, was Kamapuaa, the pig god. So if you're there, you're technically, the only people that should be there are the people that are related to him, his children. So they're descended from that god or ancestor. In that context, when you need mana, you ask him for it. Because one of the things that makes those things different than regular people, again, going to our screen analogy, is regular people, like Hawaiians living in Kahana, are on our side of the screen. They're seeing the black and white version. The ancestor god, Kamapuaa, moves freely between both sides of the screen. So he's both in the complex colored part and in our part. So in that context, that's why you ask him for assistance, because he has the ability to tap resources and see other things that you cannot see, interact with other things you cannot interact with. And that's why he's so valuable, because he's family, he will listen to you. And so when you're looking at totemic, it's this idea of the relationship of clan and access to mana, with the idea of the ancestor is the one that moves through that screen and taps or accesses that for the good of its descendants, like its children or relatives, whatever you want to phrase it. Typical in most societies. This is also used for elites. When you get into the last period of Hawaiian social structure prior to European contact, with the idea of the Ariki, your high chiefs. There's the attitude that very, very high-ranked chiefs basically have the ability, at least in part, to move between the different sides of the screen. The Japanese royal family, i.e. the emperor, the imperial family in Japan, is seen as a group, as a family that can move between both sides of the screen. Now what that means is they're not normal people. They have attributes and abilities that no one else can have. So therefore, yeah, you could whack one of them and become the new emperor, but you wouldn't have that skill set. And so in many societies, you'll find that the political religious elites are oftentimes tied to this ability, again, of the screen analogy, of being able to move between things that normal people do not have the ability to do. And that puts them in a sort of an untouchable position, in the sense that they are, they have unique abilities that no one else is going to try to compete with, because you can't compete with something you have no access to. Mythology, priest, and shaman. I've already gone through shaman, so I might as well explain it in detail. When you're looking at mythology or myths, what you're actually looking at, in the same way that if I really knew how to do this class in a really good way, what I would come up with a whole series of really entertaining, interesting, very short stories. And in each of those stories, I would package what I wanted you to remember. And you'd remember a lot more about the class because it would be interesting stories. One thing I found over the years, because I've been showing that video you just watched, or the video you're going to watch, the one on setting the guy doing the acupuncture, is that people will come back to me 5 years after they've taken your class, and the only thing they'll remember is that video, which is sort of depressing, because they've totally forgotten the rest of the whole point of the course, but they still remember that. It sticks to their mind because it's a story. If you want people to remember stuff, it's best to put it in an entertaining story. If you put it in a story, people will remember the story. And if you've embedded what you want them to remember, it's embedded in the story, and whether they think about it or not, they've remembered what it is you wanted them to know, because it's embedded in the story. That's why storytelling is such a central part in many societies, because that's how you tell the important parts of things. And one of the main things you do in storytelling is tell the religion, tell the belief system of the group. So Hawaiian traditional chants, especially, for example, the movement of Hi'iaka from the Big Island for her sister Pele, moving from the Big Island to Kauai to pick up Lohiau and bring him back to the Big Island. Hugely unitarian, just massive series of stories. In that context, what you're actually talking about is a series of stories which talk about the relationship of different ancestors and gods in the different islands, and the relative power structure, and a whole bunch of other stuff. If you'd done that in a lecture, it would take probably a couple of weeks and no one would remember it. If you put it into a series of fascinatingly interesting chants and stories, then people remember it. My personal favorite would be Journey to the West of the Monkey stories in Chinese literature. A superb, 3,500 page long series of stories about, the relationship of Buddhism to Taoism and ancestor gods and all sorts of other stuff like that. But in the context of hugely entertaining stories, which people have transmitted orally and in written form and in dramas and everything for the last 1,500 years. And I think right now there's two new monkey productions in production right now as we speak. There were 3 monkey movies or monkey productions done in 2019. So here it is, it's been around since probably about 500 AD. And as of we speak, every year or two, there's at least one more movie and or cartoon and or something of this. And in that process of telling those stories, they're also telling a whole series of things about the Chinese traditional belief system, the relationship of people to ancestors, the idea of social and moral responsibility tied to religion, and a whole mess of stuff that if you actually did it in lectures, people would collapse over in exhaustion and boredom in probably 5 minutes. You do it in stories and people are still telling them 1,000 years later. So mythology is the collective sets of stories that the group generates to basically reinforce and pass down to the next generation the centralized values and attitudes of a group. And in that, much of it is then couched or built into the religion. The Old Testament of the Bible is a mythos of the belief system of the Jews at the time that they had the religious system. So a lot of the Bible, especially parables or proverbs and books like that, are intentionally stories, because in the stories, people will remember what it is you want them to remember, versus having a textbook. And this is why, of course, most of your major religious texts do tend to be built up as forms of story. The Ramayana, probably the most famous in the Hindu system. Because then it persists, and in persisting, it carries the belief religious system on. So mythology has always been a big part of anthropology, because mythology is a very handy way to understand what a group thinks about themselves and what they want to transmit to the next generation about themselves and about the world around them through the telling of these ritualized, structured stories. And so mythology is never only entertainment. Now, there's entertainment that isn't mythological. And again, I suppose since you guys probably read them when you were kids, the Harry Potter books would be a good example of entertainment that's not mythic. On the other hand, if you're British or something like that, then the stories of King Arthur, which are, and especially Merlin, which are entertainment, originally are mythos. They're part of a series of originally oral stories told in the Greek and the Anglo-Saxon period, to basically build up a set of religious and social logics that were important to the group. So, priest versus shaman, very simple definition of this. When you look at religions basically have sort of two central structures to them. One structure would be that most people know what's going on in the religion most of the time. So if you go to the Indonesian thing, and you remember that bit where the guys are going into trance, especially the guys that are going into deep trance, everyone in that audience watching has a pretty good idea of how the religion works. They have a really good idea what trance is. And they don't want to be a part of it. That's why they're outside watching. And they have a pretty good idea what the results are going to look like. So most of the folks in Indonesia, when they're watching those ritual or religious activities, are very much engaged and involved in it and know what's actually happening and know what the results are going to be. So they know if you do X, then you're going to get Y. In those type of situations, what you're not going to find is a lot of priests. You're not going to full-time religious specialists. What you're going to find is part-time religious specialists. So you think of like the acupuncture guy, or the folks that were both going through the screen, not even folks that were going into trance, but also some of the folks that were watching to keep them to not go into bad trance. A lot of those folks are involved in what looked like sort of pretty complicated tasks. They only do that part of the time. And that's the definition of shaman. Shamans are people that do ritual or religious activities part-time. And the rest of the time, they're just normal people. And the reason they are that way is simply because most people know how most of the religion works most of the time. So there's no really large body of knowledge that's unique and hidden within a small population. Now, in the traditional Hawaiian system, in the older system, the ancestral-based Kamapuaa type system, that would have been a system where you would have found technically folks that would be called shamans, because everyone knew how the religion worked. Everyone knew what the relationship was with the ancestor. Everyone knew how you did the rituals, and in many cases, they all did the rituals. So they had a very intimate knowledge of how everything worked and what the expectations were. Especially with universalistic religion, this seems to be pretty normal. I don't know if there's a direct correlation. But when religions get very complicated, and oftentimes religions tend to get complicated because the social system has become complicated. So when a group gets set up as a group of specialists who are the only people that actually know how the religion works, that's what a priest is. A priest is a full-time religious specialist. In other words, that's what they do, which means the community supports them, feeds them, houses them, whatever, and they do religious stuff. Now, what the side effect, one of the side definitions of that is the reason that they're specialists, because there's so much that you have to know that most people don't know. And a good example would be Catholicism in, say, the 13, 14, 1500s when the Reformation starts. Catholic Mass was done in Latin, and the vast majority of the population in almost all of Western Europe didn't understand a word of Latin. So they know there's a ritual service going on, but they have no idea what the hell's being said. And they trust the priest to do it right, because they have no idea, they don't understand the logic of the ceremony. They understand what they want out of it, but the entire ceremony is basically hidden to them in the sense that they don't have the specialized knowledge to understand it. And that's not unique to Christianity. That's true of most of the universalistic religions. The level of insight that's needed requires years of study, et cetera, and that's when you get the idea of the priest. And what that also means then is now you've moved that religion from the standpoint of the Indonesian system, where everyone watching something happen and understanding both what's going on and the consequences, to, for example, someone sitting in a mosque listening to an imam talk about the detailed aspects of Islam that they don't understand, or their Christian counterpart at a religious service, again, in a language they don't necessarily understand, or in a Buddhist situation with a Buddhist priest in Japan lecturing you about, the role of the, Amitabha Buddha in something. And they have a specialized set of knowledge that other people don't. So you basically give them the authority, give them the right to basically decide for you what the religion is in many ways. And that becomes their job. They are religious specialists. Shamans are not religious specialists. They're people that practice particular aspects of religion. So what you're going to find is if you find a religion with shamans, that tells you that most of the people in that society have a pretty good grasp about how the religion works. If you find a religious social system that has priests, which you can pretty much guarantee is a large part of the population really doesn't have a particularly good grasp of a lot of the technical aspects of the religion. And that's why you have specialists that do it. It's one of the huge differences that tends to be very typical of universalistic religions. There's a lot of mystery, if you would, in universalistic religions that has to be done by specialists. And the general population trusts those people, which also in the case of Hawaii, for example, in the late period prior to European contact, you end up with Tong or Kahuna, who are specialized priests, and the vast majority of the population doesn't understand what's going on. You've moved away from ancestors to four high gods. That system is the one that collapses in the 1820s when basically the political leadership says the priests are false. And in a very quick turn of events, snap entirely done by Hawaiians to Hawaiians, the general population rises up and in most cases just wipes the priest out. They decide that they don't need that relationship and they don't need those specialists anymore because they don't necessarily maybe believe the relationship. And poof, that part of that religion just disappears almost literally within weeks. So it isn't necessarily from outside. The Hawaiian traditional religion in that part disappears from the congregation, gets rid of it. Now, having said that, if you're familiar with a lot with Hawaiian religion, the older system of ancestors persists and is still around very strongly today in many areas of Hawaii. So I don't know of anyone who would identify themselves as a Ku priest in 2020. There might be a couple, but I'm not sure they have a number of people that buy that. But there's a ton of people that did interact with their ancestors on a very common daily, if not hourly basis, and talk to them all the time, whether they're awake or sleep or whatever. So in that situation, the older system, which would be sort of the shamanistic, people with knowledge of what's going on, is actually still incredibly common here in Hawaii. The later system, the isolated, specialized, priest-based system, pretty much disappears between 1820 and 1822. Ironically, just before the Christian missionaries get here. So shaman versus priest. Not only are they different type of people, different type of skill sets. Of course, I guess most of the last part would be if you're a priest, you can do a ceremony. And this actually was one of the critiques of the Catholic Church done by the Reformation guys like Martin Luther, is they argued a lot of the priests weren't even doing the Latin ceremonies right because they didn't really know how to speak Latin. So they were arguing if you're actually doing a prayer and you screw up the prayer because you don't know how you're doing it, the congregation doesn't know because they don't speak that language at all. So you've disassociated the population from part of the technical aspects of the religion. If you're a shaman, if you're those guys in Indonesia doing the trance, everyone knows what a trance looks like. Everyone knows how you're supposed to do it. Everyone knows when it's done right. And they also know when it's done wrong. So if you try to do something you don't have a clue, people are going to be over you in a second because they know enough about what's going on and go, wait, hold it, time out. What the hell do you think you're doing? So shamans have to be successful. In many societies, if you're a shaman and you, for example, if you're supposed to be a healing shaman, this is true in northern Mexico, and you take on healing someone and you fail, let's say that person dies, the shaman's life is forfeit. The family who's the person that died, that family can take your life. So, if you're going to be a shaman, you're going to heal people in a lot of societies, you better have your act together, because you literally are putting your life on the line. That would never happen with a priest. When a priest tries to heal someone who doesn't work, then it's something else's fault, because everyone else doesn't understand the technicalities of how the religion actually works. That's the purview of the priest. Let me do that. I'll get back to revitalization later. I'm going to hop around it here because I'm on a thread here, so I might as well follow it since the video ties into this. I already went over this idea that magic is basically the manipulation and access of mana. And again, use that screen analogy, going through to a more complicated, more dense, more convoluted world, which is the reality of the universe versus the very small sort of black and white part we live in, is the function of magic and people that do magic. And the main thing that they're bringing back with them, in some cases it would be knowledge, but in many cases it would actually be mana or chi. Witchcraft and sorcery, this is always, this used to be a big thing in anthropology, talking about the one or the other. I've never really been convinced. I've never really understood the difference. I mean, as it's coming from a society where we actually practice it, so I'm not sure. I guess it's sorcery. I'm not sure it's witchcraft per se. But I certainly have known witches in northern Mexico. And witchcraft and sorcery are oftentimes defined both by what you're doing or why you're doing it. Just use the book definition. I don't want to get into it because I'm not really sure I'm comfortable with it in terms of the definitions, but they are standard in anthropology, so just know them. Spirit possession and trance, we've already gone over that. And again, the video is probably one of the best examples you ever see of actually people doing it versus someone sort of, trying to explain it for the History Channel or something like that. When you're looking at things like witchcraft or sorcery, when you're looking at the manipulation of magic and the people that do that, it's important to remember that in most societies, in fact, I'd say without exception, in societies where it's still part of an integrated belief system, you're going to find that the folks that do witchcraft or sorcery are actually serving a whole set of functions to the group, other than just sort of whatever that particular goal is. In northern Mexico, it's really common to accuse people of sorcery. In fact, if I remember, I'm going to send you another video to watch, which is actually about killing people in New Guinea because of the accusations of being a witch, which is actually a good example of this. But I remember this from experiences in northern Mexico, especially in Sonora province, that you will get people will say if someone dies unexpectedly, or in some cases even if it's expected, but if they suddenly keel over, immediately people will start looking around for what caused it. Now remember, again, religion is dealing with the unknowable. So, there's no smoking gun, there's no, spear in the back or something like that. So it's all of a sudden, someone that appeared, we'll say healthy, it's all of a sudden punked or gone. Now it could be that literally, they're riding a moped and they get hit by a truck. But why were they there when the truck was there type thing? So it's still an unknowable. In that case, what you're going to do is you're going to find the word witch pops into it. This is very actually common still in Polynesia. A lot of Polynesia, when accidents happen, witchcraft is then brought in as the accusation. What you're going to find almost invariably is the person that's tagged as the person doing this will, in some cases, maybe be a member of a group that person was in conflict with that died. So if the guy in the moped had a fight with someone, the general accusations you'd find in Sonora province in Mexico would be that either a member of the person they had a fight with, of that family, is a witch and has the ability to make things happen, as it were, or that family hired someone who's a witch to make things happen and make that accident happen. So either way, what you're going to do is you're going to look for what you see as a logical answer to an unknowable situation. And so accusations of witchcraft in most societies are actually tied to social things that are occurring. So for example, if you go back and look at the Salem witch trials in Massachusetts, that was actually a reflection of the social stresses that were existing in the Massachusetts Bay Colony when those accusations occurred. Those poor ladies were killed. And so what you're actually getting is several things. One is you find a victim, i.e. a witch, and then you blame them for all this stuff, and then you basically do something to them, and now you've resolved the problem. When in actuality, what you've got is a whole set of complicated social stressors. The relationship with women, what do you do with folks that are actually not following the rules? And so what you've done is you've sort of whacked the messenger, but you haven't really dealt with the situation. But you've also done several things. One is the things you basically explained what happened. The witch made it happen, the witch did it. So you've provided an explanation for something that hasn't an explanation in observation, i.e. religion again. You've shaped a set of behaviors. What this person did was wrong because they shouldn't have done that. So you've also reinforced the norms of the group about how you're supposed to do things. For example, deal with conflict and conflict resolution. You're also reinforcing the values of the group. You know, witchcraft is bad. Doing magic to kill people or make accidents happen is bad. Therefore, we're going to punish and say, kill this person. So you're actually doing a whole set of like morality plays or stories when you see groups accusing someone of witchcraft or accusing a group of witchcraft or accusing a family very frequently of witchcraft. So witchcraft is almost never, despite sort of the American ethos, which is the idea of like what black witches are bad witches if you just had Halloween. That's actually not the scenario in societies. In societies, when witchcraft is happening, it's actually an indicator of all sorts of stuff. And this is why if anthropologists are used to a particular group, they've worked there for a while, when they hear accusations of witchcraft, their ears are going to get really, really large, and they're really going to start looking around trying to figure out not only what supposedly happened, but also what's being talked about. In many cases, what isn't being talked about. What is it the group's uncomfortable talking about that they're using the excuse of witch or witchcraft because they don't really want to talk about what the actual social issue is. And that's what happened in Massachusetts with the Salem witch trials. The society was changing. The society didn't want to change. The society didn't want to accept that change was happening. So you have accusations of witchcraft because then that sort of, makes a nice, tidy, easy solution, and you can pretend the problem's gone away when it actually hasn't really done much of anything. Okay. Shaman, again, that's the word we use in anthropology. These occur in many forms. My family's trained, as I suppose, as divination, in the sense that you're trained in terms of finding out why something happened. Other families, at least in the Arapaho Cheyenne, are actual, what you would call healers, in the sense they do magic for healing. We have a lot of stories of folks that basically kill people through sorcery, magic, through manipulation of mana. Societies which have these, but the key thing with all these people is they don't do this stuff all the time. It isn't like Grimm's fairy tales where you have some sort of weird lady dressed in black living in a little gingerbread house, 365, 24/7, doing weird stuff with a bowl or something like that. These are invariably part-time jobs. So if you do divination, that's something you do occasionally. The rest of the time you're just doing whatever else it is you're good at. Same with someone who's a witch doctor, or more accurately be a magician healer. They only do that part of the time. Usually we call them, and most societies usually call them, in fact in anthropology, we usually call them medicine men or medicine women. We don't, witch doctor is a real old, very ethnocentric sort of Anglo-European term for colonialism, the colonialism period. So we'll sort of start with that. That gives you enough to then, if you haven't watched the video, now watch the video. If you have watched the video, I'd recommend at least go through in your mind what you saw. I'd strongly recommend you go back and look at it again. That's a really, really valuable video. And I will post the other one on New Guinea issues of contemporary witchcraft and sorcery and how it's dealt with in a modern society that's undergoing a huge amount of change.